December 8, 1948, Moscow. The manila folder landed on Colonel Pyotr Fedotov's desk in the MGB headquarters on Lubyanka Square, with enough force to scatter ash from his cigarette across intercepted American technical documents. Inside were photographs that would challenge every assumption Soviet leadership held about American industrial decline in the post-war era. "Comrade Colonel," Major Ivan Serov reported, standing rigidly before the desk, "our agents in Fort Worth confirm the Americans are now producing one complete B-36 strategic bomber every 7 days." Fedotov, head of Foreign Intelligence for the Ministry of State Security, MGB, studied the photographs with growing disbelief. The B-36 Peacemaker wasn't just large, it was monstrous. With a wingspan of 230 feet, longer than most city blocks, and a maximum takeoff weight of 410,000 pounds, it was the largest bomber ever built, and the Americans were rolling them out weekly from a single factory in Texas. "This is impossible," Fedotov muttered. "The specifications alone, 6 piston engines, 4 jet engines, a range of 10,000 miles. No one builds such complexity at this speed." What neither man fully grasped in that moment was that they were witnessing the beginning of the most significant intelligence failure of the early Cold War, the systematic inability of Soviet leadership to comprehend American post-war industrial capacity, leading to catastrophic strategic miscalculations that would haunt the USSR for decades. The intelligence begins. The first reports had arrived in late 1946, when the prototype XB-36 made its maiden flight. Soviet agents embedded in labor unions at Convair's Fort Worth plant sent coded messages describing an aircraft that seemed to defy the laws of engineering. NKVD resident Anatoly Yatskov, operating from the Soviet consulate in San Francisco, had cultivated sources among aviation engineers who traveled between California's aircraft plants and Texas. One source, an American aeronautical engineer named Robert Williams, who frequented a Communist Party study group in Berkeley, provided detailed observations after visiting Fort Worth in early 1947. Williams, unaware his casual conversations were being recorded, described the B-36's specifications over dinner at a Russian restaurant on Telegraph Avenue. "The thing is a flying battleship," Williams said, sketching dimensions on a napkin. "Empty weight, 166,000 pounds. That's more than 3 loaded B-29s. The bomb bay is 15 feet long. They're designing it to carry the new hydrogen bombs. Maximum range with a 10,000-pound bomb load. 10,000 miles. That means they can hit Moscow from Texas and return home." The NKVD agent, posing as a philosophy graduate student, asked about production timelines, feigning academic interest in industrial organization. "Convair is tooling up for mass production," Williams continued. "They're hiring 30,000 workers. The assembly line they're building is unlike anything I've seen. They're applying automobile production principles to aircraft construction, but at a scale that seems impossible." The Fort Worth plant. By mid-1947, Soviet intelligence had assembled a comprehensive picture of Convair's Fort Worth facility through multiple sources: labor organizers, suppliers, railroad workers, and even aerial reconnaissance photographs taken by a sympathetic Mexican pilot flying lost near the Texas border. The intelligence painted a disturbing picture. Plant specifications. Main assembly building, 1.25 million square feet under one roof. Employment, 32,000 workers at peak production. Assembly line length, nearly a quarter mile. Production method, moving assembly line adapted from automobile manufacturing. Shift operation. 3 shifts. 24-hour production. Capital investment, $85 million, equivalent to $1.1 billion in 2025. GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence, Officer Colonel Sergei Shtemenko, who had spent time in the United States during the wartime alliance, prepared a detailed analysis for the General Staff. His report, dated March 15, 1948, laid out the strategic implications. The B-36 represents a fundamental shift in the strategic balance. For the first time, the Americans possess an aircraft capable of striking any target in the Soviet Union from bases in the continental United States. Our entire defensive strategy assumes we have geographic protection, vast distances that enemy bombers cannot cross. The B-36 eliminates this advantage completely. The production rate that defied belief. The most shocking intelligence came through an unlikely source: Spanish diplomats. Spain, officially neutral but sympathetic to anti-communist causes, maintained relationships with both sides during the early Cold War. Spanish commercial attaché Miguel Serrano, based in Dallas, developed close relationships with Convair executives, while secretly providing reports to Soviet intelligence in exchange for valuable trade concessions. In November 1948, Serrano attended a reception at the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce, where he met Floyd Odlum, president of Consolidated Vultee Aircraft Corporation, Convair. Odlum, proud of his company's achievement and seeking to attract more government contracts, spoke freely about the B-36 program. "Mr. Serrano," Odlum said, accepting a bourbon from a circulating waiter, "what we've accomplished here represents the peak of American industrial capability. We're now producing one complete B-36 bomber every week, sometimes faster during peak periods. Last month, we delivered 4 aircraft in 23 days. Serrano, an engineer by training, pressed for details about how such complexity could be maintained at such speed. "It's all about breaking down the process," Odlum explained, warming to his subject. "The B-36 contains 1.4 million individual parts. We've organized production into 47 major subassembly sections. The wings are built in one area, the fuselage in another, the empennage in a third. Each section moves along its own assembly line. Then they converge at precise points for final assembly." "But surely," Serrano interjected, "such a massive aircraft requires highly skilled craftsmen, no?" "The Soviet approach would be to have master builders supervising every detail." Odlum laughed. "That's the old way. We've broken each job down into simple, repetitive tasks. A woman who was making sandwiches in a diner 6 months ago is now installing hydraulic systems in the bomb bay. We train workers in days, not years. The key is standardization. Every B-36 is identical to every other B-36. Every part fits every plane." This conversation, transcribed from Serrano's memory and transmitted to Moscow via encrypted telegraph, reached Stalin's desk within a week. His response, scrawled in red pencil across the report: "Verify." Americans always exaggerate their capabilities. Independent verification, Soviet intelligence, well trained in the necessity of confirming information through multiple independent sources, cast a wide net. Reports flooded in from various channels throughout 1949 and 1950. From Swedish neutrality, engineer Lars Anderson, visiting Fort Worth as part of a Scandinavian trade delegation, reported observing 3 B-36 in various stages of final assembly simultaneously. His technical assessment confirmed the production rate and described an industrial organization of stunning efficiency with materials flowing to the assembly line with clockwork precision. From Argentine contacts, commercial pilot Eduardo Ramirez, making regular cargo runs to Dallas, photographed the Fort Worth plant from the air. His images, passed to Soviet intelligence through sympathetic Union contacts, showed dozens of completed B-36 parked at the adjacent Carswell Air Force Base, awaiting delivery, with more visible on the final assembly line through the plant's skylights. From railroad workers, Brotherhood of Railway Workers, members tracked aluminum shipments to the Fort Worth plant. Reports indicated Convair was receiving 22 railroad cars of aluminum per week, over 2,000 tons monthly. GRU analysts calculated this was sufficient for producing approximately 4 B-36 weekly, confirming the reported production rate. From Turkish observers, military attachés from neutral Turkey, maintaining relationships with both NATO and Soviet representatives, provided technical assessments of B-36 performance during Air Force demonstration flights. Their reports confirmed the aircraft's strategic capability. Range sufficient to strike Baku oil fields from bases in Germany. Ceiling of 45,000 feet places it above effective range of current Soviet fighters. Bomb load capacity 86,000 pounds, equivalent to 43 tons of high explosive. The MGB assessment. By January 1950, MGB had compiled intelligence from 23 independent sources, all confirming consistent data about B-36 production and capabilities. Colonel Fedotov prepared a comprehensive briefing for presentation to the Politburo. His report included confirmed production data, first operational delivery, June 1948. Production rate, 1 complete aircraft every 6 to 8 days. At steady state total produced to date, approximately 95 aircraft. Projected production through 1954, 380 aircraft. Cost per aircraft, $3.6 million. Manufacturing cost only. Strategic capabilities. Combat radius, 4,000 miles with maximum bomb load. Service ceiling, 45,000 feet. Crew, 13 to 15 personnel. Defensive armament, 16 by 20 mm cannon in remote-controlled turrets. Nuclear capability, can carry atomic weapons up to 42,000 pounds. Industrial implications. Convair Fort Worth represents largest single aircraft production facility in the world. Production rate exceeds Soviet entire strategic bomber output. Quality control maintains consistent performance across all units. American industrial capacity remains at near wartime levels, despite peacetime conversion, the Kremlin's response. On February 4, 1950, Colonel Fedotov and Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, Deputy Minister of Defense, presented the B-36 intelligence to Stalin and the Politburo in Stalin's Kremlin office. The meeting, documented in now declassified Soviet archives, revealed the deep skepticism Soviet leadership maintained toward American capabilities. Stalin, smoking his pipe and studying the photographs spread across the conference table, listened to Fedotov's presentation without interruption. When the colonel finished, Stalin spoke quietly, but with unmistakable contempt. "Comrade Colonel, you present me with fairy tales. You claim the capitalist Americans, whose economy we were told was collapsing into post-war depression, are producing an 80-ton strategic bomber every week. This is the same America where workers are supposedly starving and unemployment is rampant." Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov added, "The photographs could be fabrications. The Americans are masters of propaganda. They exaggerated their production during the war. Why should we believe them now?" Marshal Malinovsky, one of the few Soviet leaders with genuine understanding of modern industrial warfare, tried to inject reality into the discussion. "Comrade General Secretary, our intelligence is consistent across all sources. The B-36 is real, the production rate is real, and the threat is immediate. With 95 aircraft already operational and more being produced weekly, the Americans will soon have a fleet capable of devastating our industrial centers." Stalin's response was characteristic. "Then we must build better. Comrade Tupolev will design our own strategic bomber. We will match American production." What Stalin didn't understand, what the entire Soviet leadership couldn't comprehend, was that matching American production wasn't a matter of willpower or ideological commitment. It was a matter of fundamental industrial capacity that the USSR simply didn't possess. The Soviet aviation industry reality. While Convair was producing one massive B-36 every week, the entire Soviet aviation industry was struggling with far simpler aircraft. The Tupolev Tu-4, essentially a reverse-engineered copy of the American B-29 that the Soviets had obtained during the war, required months to produce a single airframe. Soviet aircraft factories operated under completely different organizational principles. Soviet production methods: highly skilled craftsmen building aircraft like custom furniture. Each aircraft slightly different from others due to hand-fitting production time, 8 to 12 months per 2-4 bomber. Quality inconsistent due to material shortages. Workers, largely prisoners, and forced labor with minimal training. American production methods: semi-skilled workers performing repetitive specialized tasks. Perfect interchangeability of all parts across all aircraft. Production time: 6 to 8 days per B-36 bomber. Consistent quality through statistical process control. Workers: voluntary workforce with extensive training and high wages. The contrast couldn't have been starker. While American workers were producing strategic bombers in days, Soviet workers required months. The implications were devastating to Soviet strategic planning. The human intelligence failure. Perhaps the most revealing intelligence came from an unexpected source: John Scott, an American communist who had worked in Soviet factories during the 1930s before returning to the United States. In 1950, disillusioned with Stalinism, Scott met with Soviet intelligence officer Vasily Zarubin at a cafe in New York City. Scott, who had become a technical writer for aviation industry publications, explained the fundamental difference between Soviet and American industrial organization. "You're approaching this all wrong," Scott told Zarubin. "You think the B-36 production rate is propaganda because you're measuring it against Soviet capabilities. But American industry doesn't work like Soviet industry. Here, they've spent decades perfecting mass production. Ford was building a car every minute before the war. A bomber every week is actually slow by American automobile standards. They've just scaled up the complexity." Scott pulled out a copy of Aviation Week magazine featuring detailed diagrams of the B-36 production line. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the diagrams. Conveyor hired efficiency experts from Ford Motor Company to design the assembly process. They studied how Ford built cars and applied those principles to bombers. The result is that building a B-36 takes about 160,000 man-hours of labor, less than a 2-4, even though the B-36 is twice as large. Zarubin's report of this conversation reached Moscow, but was dismissed as more American propaganda. The very concept of such efficiency contradicted Marxist-Leninist economic theory, which held that only socialist-planned economies could achieve optimal production efficiency. The strategic reconnaissance evidence. In 1951, Soviet intelligence authorized a dangerous operation: direct aerial reconnaissance of the Fort Worth facility. A Soviet Air Force colonel, flying a modified 2-4 with long-range cameras, entered American airspace from Mexico at high altitude, photographed the Convair plant, and fled back across the border before U.S. fighters could intercept. The photographs were stunning. Photo analysts at GRU headquarters spent weeks examining the images with magnifying glasses and measuring tools. Their conclusions were unambiguous. Photographic Analysis Report. Parking lots contain approximately 8,000 automobiles, indicating 3 shifts, 24-hour operations. 14 completed B-36 aircraft visible at Carswell, AFB, adjacent to plant assembly line, visible through skylights. Shows 6 aircraft in various stages of completion. Rail yards contain 47 freight cars being loaded, unloaded. Electrical transformer farm indicates power consumption of 25 megawatts. No evidence of deception or fakery. This is genuine mass production. The senior photo analyst wrote in his assessment, "These images confirm all previous human intelligence. The Americans have achieved mass production of strategic bombers at a scale we cannot match. Recommend immediate strategic reassessment of defensive requirements." The report was filed away. No strategic reassessment occurred. The Tupolev response. Andrei Tupolev, the Soviet Union's most respected aircraft designer, was tasked with creating a Soviet equivalent to the B-36. The resulting aircraft, the Tu-85, first flew in 1951. It was impressive by Soviet standards, a large, long-range bomber with a 6,000-mile range. But the Tu-85's development revealed the fundamental gap between Soviet and American capabilities. Tu-85 versus B-36. Comparison, range, Tu-85, 6,000 miles, versus B-36, 10,000 miles. Bomb load, Tu-85, 11,000 pounds, versus B-36, 86,000 pounds. Production time, Tu-85, 6 to 8 months, versus B-36, 6 to 8 days. Total produced, Tu-85, 2 prototypes, versus B-36, 383 operational aircraft. The Tu-85 program was cancelled after only 2 prototypes. It was too expensive, too complex for Soviet industry to mass produce, and already obsolete compared to American capabilities. The USSR instead focused on developing jet bombers, hoping to leapfrog American technology rather than match American production. The intelligence officers who knew within Soviet intelligence, a small group of officers understood the full implications of American B-36 production. These men, veterans of intelligence operations in the West who understood American industrial capacity, tried desperately to communicate the truth to leadership. Colonel Pyotr Fedotov wrote in a classified memo dated May 1951, "We face not a temporary American advantage, but a fundamental industrial superiority that threatens Soviet security. The B-36 production rate demonstrates capabilities we cannot match. If war comes, American bombers will devastate our cities while we lack means to strike back effectively." General Ivan Serov, who would later head the KGB, privately told colleagues, "We spent the Great Patriotic War receiving American trucks, planes, and supplies through Lend-Lease. We saw their production capacity firsthand. Why do we now pretend they cannot do what we witnessed them doing?" But speaking such truths was dangerous. In Stalin's USSR, acknowledging American superiority could be interpreted as defeatism or even treason. Intelligence officers learned to report facts, but soften their implications, to present data without drawing uncomfortable conclusions. The Korean War revelation, the Korean War 1950 to 1953, provided brutal confirmation of American industrial supremacy. While the USSR supplied North Korea and China with aircraft, the numbers told a devastating story. Aircraft deployments to Korea. United States, over 1,800 combat aircraft deployed, with replacements available. Soviet Union, approximately 650 aircraft supplied to allies, representing significant portion of production. More telling was aircraft replacement rate. When American aircraft were lost in combat, replacements arrived within weeks. When Soviet-supplied aircraft were lost, replacement took months. The production gap wasn't just numerical, it was the difference between sustainable attrition and strategic exhaustion. B-36S, though never used in combat over Korea, served as the ultimate strategic deterrent. Their presence at bases in Guam and Okinawa represented the unspoken threat. If the war escalated to total conflict, American strategic bombers could reach Soviet cities while Soviet bombers could not reach American heartland. The economic reality. By 1952, Soviet economists conducting classified analyses understood the scale of the problem. One report, prepared for the Central Committee, laid out the stark mathematics. Comparative Industrial Analysis, USG DP 1950, 300 billion, Soviet GDP 1950, $126 billion, estimated. U.S. steel production, 1950, 96 million tons. Soviet steel production, 1950, 27 million tons. U.S. aluminum production, 1950, 719,000 tons. Soviet aluminum production, 1950, 250,000 tons. U.S. electricity generation, 1950, 388 billion kilowatt-hours. Soviet electricity generation, 1950, 91 billion kilowatt-hours. The single fort, worth B-36 plant, consumed resources equivalent to what small Soviet cities required for all purposes. Convair's monthly aluminum consumption, 2,000 tons, equaled the monthly aluminum allocation for the entire Soviet aviation industry. The economist who prepared this report concluded, American capacity to produce sophisticated weapons at mass production rates represents a strategic advantage we cannot overcome through willpower alone. We lack the industrial base, the trained workforce, the capital equipment, and the organizational methods to match American production. The report was classified top secret and shown only to a handful of Politburo members. Its conclusions were never acted upon. The declassified truth. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russian historians gained access to decades of classified intelligence files. What they discovered confirmed what many had long suspected. Soviet intelligence had accurately assessed American B-36 capabilities. But Soviet leadership had refused to believe the intelligence because it contradicted their worldview. Historian Dmitry Volkogonov, given access to Soviet military archives, wrote in 1995, Our intelligence services provided accurate, detailed information about American bomber production. The failure was not in collection, but in acceptance. Leaders who had built their careers on the premise of capitalist weakness could not admit that America possessed overwhelming industrial superiority. Former KGB Colonel Oleg Kalugin confirmed in his memoirs, We knew exactly what the Americans were producing. We had sources in their factories, photographs of their assembly lines, intercepted communications. But when we reported this to Moscow, we were told we were being deceived by American propaganda. It became career suicide to insist the reports were accurate. The final accounting. The B-36 program ended in 1954, having produced 383 aircraft total over 8 years. The final statistics revealed the full extent of what Soviet intelligence had tried to communicate. B-36. Program final numbers. Total produced 383 aircraft production peak, 1950 to 1952, at approximately 4 aircraft per month, 1 per week. Total program cost, $1.4 billion, $14 billion in 2025 dollars. Man-hours per aircraft, 160,000, reduced from 160,000, 300,000 initially. Operational service, 1948 to 1959. Combat missions flown, 0 served as deterrent only. Strategic effect, incalculable, forced Soviet defensive spending and strategic bomber development. By comparison, Soviet strategic bomber production, 1948 to 1954, 2-4, Bull, 847 aircraft produced, reverse-engineered B-29, 285, 2 prototypes, cancelled. Myasishchov, M4, Bison, 93 aircraft, jet bomber entering service 1954, total, approximately 940 strategic bombers versus 383 B-36S. But the numbers don't tell the full story. American B-36s could reach any Soviet target from American bases. Soviet bombers required forward bases to reach American targets. The B-36 could carry 10 times the bomb load of a 2-4. Most critically, America was producing the B-36 while simultaneously developing even more advanced bombers, the B-47 and B-52, that would render the entire Soviet bomber fleet obsolete. Lessons learned. The Soviet intelligence failure regarding B-36 production offers several profound lessons. Cognitive dissonance. Accurate intelligence that contradicts core ideological beliefs will be rejected, regardless of evidence quality. Soviet leadership couldn't accept American industrial superiority because it undermined Marxist-Leninist theory about capitalist decay. Systemic barriers. Intelligence systems that punish bearers of bad news will receive only good news. Soviet officers learned to soften their conclusions to avoid accusations of defeatism. Measurement bias. Assessing opponent capabilities through the lens of one's own limitations leads to catastrophic miscalculation. Soviet leaders measured American production capacity against Soviet capacity and concluded American claims must be exaggerated. Ideological blindness. Political ideology can override mathematical reality, but reality eventually asserts itself. The B-36 existed whether Soviet leadership believed in it or not. Industrial fundamentals. Wars are won not just by courage or ideology, but by industrial capacity. The USSR couldn't match American bomber production because it lacked the fundamental industrial infrastructure to do so. The human cost. The failure to accept intelligence about American bomber production had real consequences. The USSR diverted enormous resources to defensive systems, fighters, anti-aircraft artillery, radar networks, to counter a bomber threat that leadership initially refused to acknowledge. Soviet aviation engineer Mikhail Gurevich, designer of the MiG fighters, later reflected, "We spent the 1950s in a desperate race to build fighters, capable of intercepting B-36 and B-47s. If leadership had believed our intelligence services in 1948 instead of 1951, we could have begun our defensive preparations 3 years earlier. Those 3 years cost us dearly in resources and strategic positioning." The economic burden was staggering. The USSR spent an estimated 20% of GDP on defense throughout the 1950s, much of it responding to the strategic bomber threat. This military spending came at the cost of consumer goods, housing, and living standards for Soviet citizens. The end of the story. The B-36 was retired from service in 1959, replaced by the all-jet B-52 Stratofortress. By then, the strategic landscape had changed completely. ICBMs were becoming the primary nuclear delivery system, making both American and Soviet bombers increasingly vulnerable. But the B-36's legacy wasn't in its combat record. It never dropped a bomb in anger. Its legacy was in demonstrating the vast gap between American and Soviet industrial capacity, a gap that Soviet intelligence accurately reported and Soviet leadership catastrophically ignored. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, military historians identified several key factors in the USSR's defeat in the Cold War. Near the top of every list was the simple fact that the Soviet economy could never match American industrial production. The intelligence about the B-36, reported accurately in 1948 and ignored until it was too late, was an early warning of this fundamental weakness. Epilogue. A meeting in Texas. In 1995, at the 50th anniversary celebration of the end of World War II, a remarkable meeting occurred at the restored Convair plant in Fort Worth, now part of Lockheed Martin. Former Soviet intelligence officer Colonel Pyotr Fedotov, then 78 years old, met with retired Convair production manager James Henderson. Henderson showed Fedotov around the facility, now producing F-16 fighters. Walking through the old B-36 assembly building, Henderson asked, "Did your people really not believe we could build them so fast?" Fedotov smiled sadly. "We believed it, Mr. Henderson. We reported it accurately. But our leaders couldn't accept that American workers, free workers, paid workers, workers from every background, could outproduce Soviet workers laboring under the discipline of the socialist state. To accept your production rates was to admit that our entire economic system was flawed." "Did it cost you the Cold War?" Henderson asked. "The Cold War was lost the moment we refused to believe our own intelligence services," Fedotov replied. "You didn't just build bombers in this plant. You built proof that free market democracy could organize industrial production more efficiently than socialist central planning. We had the data by 1948. We denied it until 1991. That 43-year refusal to accept reality is why I'm speaking English in Texas instead of you speaking Russian in Moscow." They stood together in the massive building where, decades earlier, American workers had produced an 80-ton strategic bomber every week, a rate Soviet intelligence accurately reported and Soviet leadership fatally refused to believe. The verdict of history is clear. Soviet intelligence was excellent. Soviet intelligence acceptance was catastrophic. In that failure lies a warning for all nations. Reality doesn't care what you believe. Those who deny uncomfortable truths in favor of comfortable ideology will ultimately be defeated by the reality they refuse to acknowledge. The B-36 built more than just bombers. It built proof that free people, working voluntarily for fair wages in a competitive market economy, could achieve industrial miracles that command economies could not match. Soviet spies counted everyone. Soviet leaders believed none. And that disbelief cost them the Cold War.